So I wanted to see if I could explore this idea of astrology as being descriptive, purely descriptive. Now, you often see astrology as being described as a causal thing. So the moon enters into Sagittarius and that causes certain things. Like, you can ask questions like, why did this happen to me? Well, because it's Mercury retrograde, because Saturn is conjuncting your moon or whatever, right? And I think, as I've talked about in other videos, I do think that is a perfectly reasonable way of talking about astrology and, by extension, about synchronicity in general. I think that you can talk about it as being like a cause, because you have to place the cause somewhere anyway, and you could just, as Carl Jung suggests, you could just keep on retreating backwards. You could say, well, okay, what caused the moon? What caused Saturn? And then what caused that cause? And you can just go backwards forever. So you might as well choose one of the elements in the chain and ascribe causality to it, if that works for you and if it works in general, I suppose. And so, yeah, that's one way of approaching it. But I was thinking of a different way of talking about astrology, which is purely descriptive. If something happens to you, like you have an accident because you know, you're not paying attention and you crash into another car, the first way of approaching astrology would say, well, this happened because Saturn is opposing this thing in your chart or whatever. And I feel as if this kind of explanation sometimes puts people off, people who are, you know, not interested in astrology. And I think that maybe a more palatable way of discussing the situation is, well, let's say that we keep all causes, all causality at a earthly human level. So you say, why did you crash against the other car? Because you were thinking about something else. And why were you thinking about something else? Because you were worried about this situation that was coming in the future. And why did the other car not notice you? Well, because this thing or whatever. So you could keep all of causality on the mundane plane and not ascribe it to anything, let's say, spiritual. Because I think even though the planets are, you know, physical things, when we ascribe causality to the planets, I think that it's, what that means usually is that you're ascribing causality to some sort of a spiritual plane. You're ascribing it to archetypal forces and archetypal dynamics and energy and stuff like that. So if you keep causality down in the material plane, you can just say, well, okay, we have the answers to our questions. The question is, why did this happen? Well, because of this, because you were worried and this thing in your life and this other thing. Now, is there any way of describing the situation? Well, that's where we enter into like abstraction. Say, what do all of these elements have in common? Well, there seems to be a lot of worry, distraction, maybe you know, feelings of let's say worry and distraction as a general energy. So you've abstracted all of these different things, like the other car and what you were thinking about specifically, and just made a little more an abstract description of it, a simplification, basically. You say, well, a simplified way of describing the situation is that there was a feeling of worry and distraction in the air. Well then, imagining, you know, that we are early humans and we are still exploring these ideas of astrology, we would say, okay, let's give a name to this type of energy, of worry and distraction. And we would ascribe it to like a certain god. Say, well, let's ascribe it to the god of worry and distraction, or whatever, and give that god a name, and the god accumulates that vibe, because then whenever another accident or another situation involving these emotions happens, it can also be described with the same simplification, the same god that unites all those things. And it's an archetype in the sense that it's things share that quality in common. Different events, different time and places in the world can share a quality. So a simplification is abstracted from all those specific cases. They share that. And people in the future will share that because they will also fear and feel distraction. And people in the past did. So it's archetypal because it's eternal. It isn't bound to... It's a description of something that somehow persists through time and space, at least from our perspective. So I think that in itself is already useful. I think that divination, astrology, tarot, the I Ching, this descriptive quality to them, the way in which you can grab a lot of separate incidents and see what they have in common, and see, an abstraction, a simpler kind of thing that they have in common, is very useful. I find that very useful somehow. You could say that it is the act of abstraction itself. It's not that astrology uses the tool we know as abstraction, but that maybe abstraction is divination. That divination is very intimately connected to abstraction, and that perhaps abstraction is very intimately connected with the future. Let's say with the future, maybe also with the past, but with the future. In that you're perceiving patterns in things that are happening. You see them happen again and again, so you recognize a similarity between them. You see that there are certain things that have the same kind of vibe to them, and that allows you to construct a weird sort of map of time. You have expectations, you have intuitions. It develops your intuition, it develops your relationship with what is coming. And so, again, I think that astrology is a lot more than that, but just for that, I find it interesting to describe the situations you're in, not to say, oh, because to say that it's caused by that sometimes can be a cop-out. You say, oh, you know, there's no responsibility down here on Earth, it's just that Mercury is retrograde. No, I think it's, to me, more interesting to say Mercury and Saturn and whatever, and the different relationships that they're in describe certain situations on Earth. Now, of course, there is the issue of the let's say, the supernatural, the paranormal aspect to this, which is, let's say, how come these descriptions are so accurate? And I think that it doesn't contradict the descriptive use of these systems. It just seems to be an experience that you can have with them is that they seem to allow you. See, it's almost as if these abstractions allow you to see experience in such a abstract way that it beckons paranormal experience. It beckons things from outside the system that hadn't been abstracted, or something like that. I don't know. So, yes, anyway, astrology as description, I think that divination is useful, even if you just want to take it as an abstraction, even that, in the same way that psychoanalysis does, even that gives you insight into the situation, right? Abstraction gives you insight. It lets you see what things have in common, what things don't have in common. It helps you relate concepts and therefore sort of understand things that maybe first seemed chaotic. It doesn't necessarily mean, again, that there is a sort of a fated, predetermined order to things. I think that this sense of order and meaning, in my view, is neither fated nor not fated. I think what's interesting to me about it is just the fact that this kind of abstract thinking or mythological archetypal thinking lets you, it kind of necessarily lets you find order in chaos, Whether there actually is order in chaos or not is a secondary question. I think that it is both things at once. There is order and there is chaos. But I think that you don't need to get caught in finding that answer, that sort of metaphysical answer, first. I think that I at least find it more interesting to find the practical sort of use of a thing, regardless of its metaphysical status. And in this case, it would be that somehow mythological abstract thinking, this kind of thinking, when you are in front of something chaotic, you can find order in it. That is to say, not by making an effort, but just spending time with chaos makes you acquainted with it. And if you become acquainted with that specific constellation of chaos, you get to know it. So it becomes known and therefore meaningful to you. Even if you have like an accident and it's completely chaotic and you sort of don't understand why it happened, I understand that from a certain perspective, some people would say, well, if you try to find meaning in that, you're just escaping the harshness of reality, right? There are things that are just chaotic. Yes, but I would say that there is a different way. There is, I think, a non-escapist way of finding meaning in chaos, which I think is also what psychoanalysis proposes, which is if you have a terrible traumatic experience that is meaningless, is absolutely chaotic, I don't think that it's a question of whether you choose to find meaning on it or not, right? It's not. Some certain visions of this seem to say, to find meaning in these experiences is an escapist thing and you shouldn't do it. I don't think you can choose. I think you will see it in a meaningful way. And you can see it in a very dark meaning that undermines you and that harms you and that causes you suffering. And as like, I think that you're going to experience meaning and you're going to experience chaos at the same time. I don't think it makes sense to try and have this Puritan attitude of cleaning away all of the meaning from reality because you think that it's an escapist muck. Again, a traumatic experience that doesn't make any sense, as in you don't know why it happened, for example. I think that from a mythological, from a magical point of view, if you find connections that abstract certain aspects from the complexity, you can find things to learn from it. You can find things to reflect on. And they might be very painful things, but you will be able to reflect on them. When it's too chaotic, your mind can't process it, I think. I think there is a certain degree of simplification that is that allows the mind to process it. And processing it, I think I would call that finding meaning in the experience. It doesn't mean that the experience was good and that you're glad that it happened. It just means that you have gotten acquainted with it. You haven't shoved it into a deep corner of your unconscious. You've sort of lived with it thanks to this simplification given by, let's say, mythological thinking, dreams, art, poetry, or whatever it may be. It may just be a conversation with your friends, or some way of processing it that is slightly closer to home, that's more in synchrony with yourself and less alien to yourself. After all, it's your experience. I don't think it makes any sense to say, "Oh, shove all that meaning away because reality is harsh." Well, yes, but this meaning that you're feeling is part of your experience. So how do you deal with that? I don't know. Yeah, that's, I suppose, enough. Thanks for listening. No, actually, just another thing. So yeah, because I think the reason I find this important is because if you're not doing this consciously, or let's say if this is not a part of, and by this I mean this way in which we simplify things. So if we repress that part of ourselves too much, and I think that sometimes in our culture we are liable to do that because we relate simplification with falsity and spirituality, superstition, religion, and stuff like that, right? We think that a simplification is fake, that actually we need to find the nitty-gritty detail, right? That's what our culture is very focused on. We need to find what's inside the atom, and then what's inside the thing that's inside the atom. And we need to sort of really we have this attitude in our culture that we need to kind of clean away all of the layers and see the pure interior. But that just polarizes. It's like trying to say that you have yin and yang and only yin is real. And we need to clean away all the dirty layers of yang. So an example of how not kind of taking that into mind can be dangerous is witch burnings. I think that in witch burnings, what happens is simplification, but unconscious simplification, right? People are in a situation of, again, chaos. Many things that they don't understand are happening at the same time, and it's a crisis. They don't know how to process it. Who knows? Famine, crime rates, maybe their family is a mess, their children aren't how they expected them to be, the crops, it's not raining enough. Maybe there's sort of chaos all around. And there is this kind of thing, I think, in the psyche that is trying to process this by finding connections between these things in order to simplify and process. But if you're resisting that and you're doing it unconsciously, what ends up happening is you say, well, all of these things, they must have, they must have a cause which explains all, this chaos can't just be chaos. It must have an explanation, and the explanation ends up being witches. And then you burn the witch, and you ritualistically sort of pretend that you're getting away with, that you're getting rid of the problem. The thing here is that why witches? Why is the image of the witch a dangerous one? I think it's because it's that aspect of themselves that they're not wanting to accept, the magical, witchy aspect of seeing the world as a magical place, of seeing the world as being, connected through meaning, and therefore simplified. That is, we're so used to hearing simplified as being something fake, that when you simplify something, you're covering your face with a veil of illusion and seeing a simplified picture. And even when I'm talking about using it for a positive end, I suppose that the way we look at it usually is, well, okay, it can have a positive end, but, let's not get too carried away with it, because we need to at all times remember that actually it's not real. But I think that the key here is, again, that in my view, there is no yin without yang. There are these two aspects to experience. There is a complexity in experience, and there's a simpleness in experience. Let's say a connection. Things become, and they can become simple by becoming connected. They can also become very complicated by becoming connected, right? There is this weird sort of middle point that we resonate with, I think, and that changes. It's not static. But in any case, that's sort of difficult to describe in words. That's why I think we jump from yin to yang. That's why it's sort of in constant flux at all levels. But I think that if we repress this mythologizing side of the psyche, it's going to come out anyway. It's just that it's going to come out in a witch burning kind of way. We're going to say, oh, and it does, of course. People see connections between all sorts of things. And they don't want to be the witch. They don't want to be the paranormal crazy person, right? They want to be a good citizen who is, on the side of truth, and so all this connection that is happening in their minds is happening at an unconscious level, and they end up saying, oh, all of these problems in my neighborhood are because of this thing, or this type of person. All my problems in my country are because of this thing. All the problems on planet Earth are because of this thing. And it can very easily, just lead to such a violent projection of the shadow onto other people that prevents you from dealing with your shadow and prevents them from dealing with their stuff, because you're putting all your stuff onto them. So, I think that seeing things archetypally in the way that archetype describes complexity and chaos is very useful, in my opinion. Or at least, is just something worth thinking about. you know, it's, yeah, something I'm interested in. I suppose that's also the final thing about it. Yeah, thanks for listening. That's it, I suppose.